The blue lights flashed behind Kyle Rogers as he pulled his Honda Civic to the curb on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from his college campus. 20-year-old pre-law student, on a roll, heading home from his evening study group with constitutional law textbooks still scattered across his passenger seat. Officer Nathan Scott stepped out of the patrol car, hand already resting on his weapon, and called out with the kind of voice that had decided guilt before asking questions. "Get out of the car, boy. Hands where I can see them." Kyle complied, slowly, just like his father had taught him. But compliance wasn't enough for Nathan Scott, who saw only what he wanted to see: a young black man in a hoodie driving through a nice neighborhood after dark. Within 90 seconds, Kyle lay bleeding on the asphalt, 3 bullets in his chest, while Nathan Scott radioed in, "Suspect down," appeared to be reaching for a weapon. What Nathan Scott didn't know was that Kyle Rogers wasn't just any college student. He was the son of federal Judge Harrison Rogers, the man who would be presiding over the police corruption trial, scheduled to begin the following Monday. Which state are you from? Have you ever watched someone with a badge decide who belongs where before they even asked a single question? The Honda Civic's engine was still running when Kyle Rogers felt his heart stop. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from the sudden realization that everything his father had taught him about respect, compliance, and the system working for everyone who followed the rules was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Kyle had been driving this route home from campus every Tuesday and Thursday for 2 years. Constitutional law seminar with Professor Martinez, followed by study group at the library until closing time. Tonight had been no different. They'd spent 3 hours dissecting Brown v. Oney, Board of Education, arguing about implementation versus intent, about how legal precedent could be twisted to serve power instead of justice. Kyle had been the most vocal advocate for systemic change, earning both admiration and gentle pushback from classmates who thought he was too idealistic. "The law is only as good as the people who enforce it," Kyle had said, packing his books into his worn leather messenger bag. "And right now, that's our biggest problem." He'd driven away from the library with windows down, March evening air carrying the scent of blooming dogwood trees and the distant sound of a pickup basketball game from the rec center. The radio played low, some late-night jazz program that reminded him of Sunday mornings when his father would cook breakfast and lecture about legal ethics between flipping pancakes. Life was good. Life was predictable. Life was about to become something else entirely. Officer Nathan Scott had been patrolling the University District for exactly 47 minutes when he spotted the Honda Civic. His shift supervisor had made it clear during roll call that they needed to maintain visibility in the area after several break-ins reported by residents who lived in the expensive houses surrounding the campus. The subtext was clear enough: keep the college kids where they belong and make sure the wrong element doesn't drift into neighborhoods where property values mattered more than constitutional rights. Nathan Scott was 28 years old and had been wearing a badge for 6 years. In that time, he developed what his training officers called good instincts, and what federal civil rights investigators would later classify as racial profiling with a pattern of escalation. He saw threats where others saw citizens. He interpreted compliance as suspicious behavior and resistance as grounds for lethal force. His personnel file contained 14 excessive force complaints, all dismissed by a department that valued solidarity over scrutiny. When Scott spotted Kyle's Civic moving slowly through the tree-lined streets, every prejudice he'd been trained to call officer safety activated at once. Young black male, nice car, but not too nice. Driving carefully, which meant he was either impaired or hiding something. In Scott's world, there was no such thing as an innocent explanation. Scott flipped on his emergency lights without calling in the stop. Standard procedure required notification to dispatch, but Scott had learned to operate in the gray areas where oversight was limited and accountability was optional. He'd pull the kid over, find something wrong, maybe discover some marijuana or an outstanding warrant. Another statistic for the monthly report, another demonstration that aggressive policing kept the community safe. Kyle saw the lights in his rearview mirror and felt his stomach drop, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because his father had spent 20 years preparing him for this moment. Judge Harrison Rogers had served on the federal bench long enough to see how justice could be corrupted by bias, how the law could be weaponized against the very people it was supposed to protect. He'd taught his son to keep his hands visible, speak clearly, never make sudden movements, and pray that the officer's training would override whatever prejudices he brought to the encounter. "If you're ever stopped," Judge Rogers had told Kyle during one of their monthly driving lessons, "remember that your life depends on keeping their fear in check. You're not just Kyle Rogers, honor student and future lawyer. In that moment, you're whatever stereotype they've decided you represent. Your job is to survive the encounter, so you can live to challenge the system later." Kyle pulled over carefully, activating his hazard lights and rolling down his window before Scott even approached the car. He placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, exactly as his father had demonstrated. His constitutional law textbooks lay open on the passenger seat, pages marked with yellow highlighter, where he'd been studying the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizure. The irony wasn't lost on him, even in his terror. Scott approached the driver's side window with his hand resting on his service weapon, a 9mm Glock that he'd drawn 16 times in 6 years of service, but never fired in the line of duty. Until tonight. "License and registration," Scott commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. Kyle reached slowly toward his glove compartment, narrating his movements as his father had taught him. "I'm reaching for my registration, officer. It's in the glove compartment." His driver's license was already in his hand, held carefully between 2 fingers so Scott could see it clearly. "I said hands where I can see them," Scott shouted, though Kyle's hands had never left his line of sight. This was the escalation pattern that Scott had perfected over 6 years of stops. Create confusion, demand compliance with contradictory orders, then justify force when the subject inevitably failed to satisfy impossible demands. Kyle froze, hands still visible, license held carefully in his right hand. "Officer, I'm complying with your request. My hands are visible, and I'm not making any sudden movements." Scott saw defiance where others would have seen textbook cooperation. The careful speech patterns, the formal language, the obvious education, all of it translated as disrespect in Scott's interpretation. This kid thought he was better than a working cop, thought his fancy vocabulary could protect him from street justice. "Get out of the car." "Now." Kyle complied, moving slowly and deliberately. He stepped out with his hands raised slightly, the driver's license still visible in his right hand. The evening air was cool against his skin, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine from a nearby yard where a motion sensor light had activated, casting long shadows across the street. "Turn around." Hands on the roof. Kyle turned to face his car, placing his palms flat on the Honda's roof. The metal was still warm from the drive, and he could hear the engine's quiet idle mixing with the distant sound of laughter from a house party 3 blocks away. Normal sounds from a normal evening in a normal neighborhood where normal people lived normal lives without fear of dying during routine traffic stops. Scott began to pat down Kyle's pockets, looking for weapons that didn't exist, drugs that weren't there, evidence of crimes that had never been committed. Kyle wore jeans and a Georgetown University hoodie that his father had bought him as motivation for law school applications. His pockets contained a wallet, keys, his phone, and a pack of gum. No contraband, no weapons, no justification for what happened next. "What's this?" Scott asked, his hand finding Kyle's phone in his back pocket.
"It's my phone, officer."
"You reaching for this when I walked up?" "No, sir. I never reached for my phone. I reached for my registration in the glove compartment, exactly as you requested." Scott's hand closed around the phone, and in that moment, Kyle made the decision that would cost him his life. He turned his head slightly to see what Scott was doing, a natural human reaction to someone searching through his personal belongings. "Don't move," Scott screamed, jerking backward and drawing his weapon in one fluid motion. Kyle's hands remained on the car roof, but his head had turned perhaps 30 degrees to see why Scott was going through his pockets. In Scott's perception, shaped by 6 years of seeing threats where none existed, this was aggressive movement from a suspect who was clearly reaching for something dangerous. "Hands up. Get your hands up." Kyle's hands were already up, flat against his car roof, exactly where Scott had told him to put them. But Scott was operating in a reality where compliance looked like resistance, where cooperation felt like defiance, where a 20-year-old pre-law student represented a mortal threat that required immediate neutralization. Kyle turned completely around, hands raised high above his head, his father's voice echoing in his memory. "Keep them calm. Keep yourself alive. Live to fight another day." "Officer, I'm complying with all of your instructions. My hands are up. I'm not reaching for anything. I don't have any weapons." Scott saw a young black man who had turned toward him despite clear instructions, who was speaking in complete sentences like he thought he was in control of the situation, who was wearing clothes that suggested education and privilege that Scott resented on a level he'd never examined. The first shot hit Kyle in the chest, spinning him backward against the Honda's driver's side door. The second shot struck him as he fell, and the third caught him as he hit the asphalt, his constitutional law textbook spilling from the car onto the street around him. Scott stood over Kyle's body, weapon still drawn, adrenaline flooding his system with the righteous satisfaction of a threat neutralized. Kyle's eyes were still open, staring up at the streetlight that illuminated the pages of his constitutional law textbook, now scattered and stained with blood that looked black under the sodium lights. Scott keyed his radio, his voice steady and professional. "Unit 47 to dispatch. Shots fired. Suspect down. Need EMS and supervisor to Maple Street, just west of the campus entrance. Suspect appeared to be reaching for a weapon. Scene is secure." The dispatcher's voice crackled back. "Copy, Unit 47. EMS and supervisor en route. Any injuries to personnel?" "Negative. Officer not injured. Suspect appears to be deceased." Kyle Rogers died at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, 3 blocks from his college campus, surrounded by the constitutional law textbooks he'd been studying in preparation for a quiz on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. His last conscious thought was of his father, wondering if Judge Harrison Rogers would be proud of how his son had handled himself in those final 90 seconds, how Kyle had followed every rule and protocol they'd practiced together, how he'd remained calm and respectful even as his life was being stolen from him. Nathan Scott holstered his weapon and began setting up a perimeter around the scene, his training taking over as he called for backup and prepared to give his statement. In his mind, the shooting was justified. A dangerous suspect had made threatening movements during a routine traffic stop. He'd followed protocol, protected himself and the community, and eliminated a threat before it could escalate further. What Scott didn't know, what wouldn't become clear until the supervisor arrived and ran Kyle's identification through the system, was that he'd just killed the son of federal Judge Harrison Rogers, the same Judge Rogers who had spent the evening reviewing evidence for the federal police corruption trial scheduled to begin Monday morning, the same Judge Rogers who had the authority to bring federal charges against corrupt officers, to dismantle departments that failed to police themselves, to ensure that civil rights violations were prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Nathan Scott had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his career, and he wouldn't realize it until the sergeant arrived 20 minutes later with a look of pure terror on his face and a phone call that would change everything. The street grew quiet after the sirens faded, leaving only the sound of Kyle's Honda Civic still idling in park, its headlights illuminating the chalk outline where a young man's dreams had died along with his body. The constitutional law textbook lay open to a chapter on police accountability and federal oversight of local law enforcement agencies, its pages fluttering in the evening breeze like prayers for justice that Kyle Rogers would never live to see answered. But his father, Judge Harrison Rogers, would answer those prayers with the full force of federal authority. And Nathan Scott was about to learn that some mistakes couldn't be covered up, dismissed, or explained away. Some mistakes demanded accountability, and some fathers had the power to ensure that accountability came with the weight of the entire justice system behind it. The reckoning was coming, and it would arrive wearing a black robe and carrying a gavel that could shatter careers, destroy corrupt systems, and send racist cops to federal prison, where their badges meant nothing and their victims' fathers controlled their fate. Nathan Scott just didn't know it yet. Federal Judge Harrison Rogers was reviewing police corruption evidence when his son died. Specifically, he was examining photographs of excessive force incidents, reading testimonies from officers who had broken their code of silence, and preparing opening statements for the most significant police accountability trial in the district's history. The irony would haunt him for the rest of his life. His chambers at the Harold T. Davis Federal Courthouse occupied the northeast corner of the 7th floor, with windows that offered a commanding view of the city he'd spent 23 years trying to protect through the careful application of constitutional law. Tonight, those windows reflected the warm light from his desk lamp as he worked past his usual hours, driven by the weight of evidence that demanded justice. The case files spread across his mahogany desk told stories of badges used as weapons, of constitutional rights trampled by officers who saw civilians as enemy combatants, of a police culture that valued loyalty over accountability. Judge Rogers had seen enough corruption cases to recognize patterns, but this investigation was different. The federal task force had uncovered systematic civil rights violations that reached from street-level officers to command staff, a conspiracy of silence that had protected criminal behavior for decades. At 9:52 p.m., Judge Rogers was reading a victim impact statement from a woman whose son had been beaten unconscious during a traffic stop when his secure phone line rang. The caller ID showed Metro Emergency Services, a number he'd never seen but which carried the unmistakable authority of official business. Judge Rogers speaking. Your Honor, this is Sergeant Patricia Williams with Metro Police Emergency Services. I'm calling to inform you that there's been an incident involving your son, Kyle Rogers. The words hit Judge Rogers like physical blows. His pen stopped moving across the legal pad where he'd been taking notes. The victim impact statement he'd been reading seemed to blur and shift on the page as his mind tried to process what he was hearing. What kind of incident? His voice remained steady, 23 years of judicial training, keeping his emotions in check, even as terror flooded his system. Sir, I'm sorry to inform you that Kyle was involved in a shooting incident at approximately 9:47 p.m. on Maple Street near the university campus. He's been transported to Metropolitan General Hospital, and I'd strongly advise you to get there as soon as possible. Judge Rogers felt the world tilt beneath him. Is he alive? The pause that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it contained eternities of dread, hope, and the desperate bargaining that grief does with reality before accepting the unthinkable.
Sir, I think it would be best if the medical staff explained Kyle's condition when you arrive at the hospital.
Judge Rogers had presided over enough death penalty cases to recognize the careful language of officials who couldn't bring themselves to deliver the worst news directly. The formal phrasing, the suggestion that medical staff should handle the conversation, the absence of any reassurance about Kyle's condition, it all pointed toward a conclusion that his mind refused to accept. Sergeant Williams, I need you to tell me exactly what happened to my son. Your Honor, there was an officer-involved shooting during a traffic stop. Kyle was struck by gunfire and transported to Metropolitan General. I don't have additional details about the circumstances, but Detective Morrison will meet you at the hospital to provide a full briefing. Officer-involved shooting. The euphemism hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had already fired. Judge Rogers had seen hundreds of these cases from the bench, had read police reports that used identical language to describe incidents where citizens died at the hands of officers who claimed to fear for their lives. Now his son was a statistic in that same system, reduced to clinical terminology that sanitized the reality of bullets and blood and a young man's dreams dying on asphalt. What officer was involved in the shooting? I'm not authorized to release that information over the phone, Your Honor. Detective Morrison will have all the details when you arrive at the hospital. Judge Rogers ended the call without saying goodbye. His hands, which had signed death warrants and life sentences with steady precision, shook as he placed the phone back in its cradle. Around him, the evidence files seemed to mock his faith in the system. Photographs of beaten suspects stared up at him from their manila folders, their injuries a preview of what he might find when he reached the hospital. He stood slowly, his body moving with the deliberate care of someone whose world had just shifted on its foundation. The police corruption case he'd been preparing suddenly felt personal in ways that terrified him. For 23 years he'd believed that the system could be reformed, that bad officers could be held accountable, that justice was possible even when it was delayed. Now his son was lying in a hospital bed or worse, and the system Judge Rogers had devoted his life to defending had potentially failed in the most devastating way possible. The drive to Metropolitan General Hospital took 16 minutes through traffic that seemed designed to torture him with delay. Every red light stretched into eternity. Every slow-moving car became an obstacle between him and whatever truth waited in the emergency room. Judge Rogers drove with the same careful precision he brought to legal arguments, but his mind raced through possibilities and scenarios, each one worse than the last. Kyle had been shot during a traffic stop. That much was clear. But why? Kyle was the most cautious driver Judge Rogers had ever known. Meticulous about following traffic laws, conscientious about vehicle maintenance, never carrying anything that could be construed as contraband. Kyle didn't drink, didn't use drugs, didn't associate with anyone who might give police a reason to view him as suspicious. Unless the reason was simply that Kyle was a young black man, driving through a neighborhood where someone had decided he didn't belong. Judge Rogers parked in the emergency room lot and walked through sliding glass doors that had witnessed thousands of similar arrivals, desperate family members rushing toward news they didn't want to hear, clinging to hope that medical science could undo whatever violence had brought them there. The hospital smell hit him immediately. Disinfectant and fear, antiseptic and anguish, the clinical odors that couldn't quite mask the human suffering that filled every room. Detective Morrison was waiting near the information desk, a middle-aged black woman whose expression carried the weight of someone who had delivered terrible news too many times in her career. She approached Judge Rogers with the careful respect due to his position, but her eyes held the sympathy reserved for grieving fathers. "Your Honor, I'm Detective Lisa Morrison with the Criminal Investigation Division. Is there somewhere private where we can talk?" They found an empty family consultation room, a sterile space designed for conversations that would shatter lives and reshape futures. Detective Morrison closed the door behind them and gestured for Judge Rogers to take a seat. He remained standing, needing whatever advantage height might give him in the conversation that was about to destroy everything he thought he knew about justice. "Detective Morrison, I need you to tell me exactly what happened to my son." "Your Honor, at approximately 9:47 p.m. tonight, Kyle was stopped for a routine traffic violation on Maple Street near the university campus. During the course of that stop, Officer Nathan Scott discharged his weapon 3 times. Kyle was struck by gunfire and transported here to Metropolitan General, where he was pronounced dead at 10:23. The words hit Judge Rogers like a physical assault. Pronounced dead. His son, who had called him just that morning to discuss law school applications, who had been studying constitutional law in preparation for following his father's footsteps into legal service, who had never harmed anyone in his 20 years of life, dead at the hands of a police officer whose name Judge Rogers didn't recognize but would never forget. What was the traffic violation? According to Officer Scott's initial report, Kyle was driving suspiciously through a residential neighborhood. The specific violation hasn't been clearly established. Driving suspiciously. Judge Rogers repeated the phrase with the same tone he used when attorneys presented arguments that insulted his intelligence. What exactly does that mean? Detective Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that she was briefing a federal judge whose son had just become another casualty in the war between police culture and constitutional rights. "Your Honor, I haven't completed my investigation yet, but preliminary evidence suggests that Officer Scott initiated the stop based on his assessment that Kyle's presence in the neighborhood warranted investigation." His presence warranted investigation. Judge Rogers felt 23 years of judicial restraint cracking under the weight of a father's rage. Kyle was 3 blocks from his campus, driving home from study group, exactly as he'd done twice a week for 2 years. What about his presence suggested criminal activity? Detective Morrison didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. They both knew what had made Kyle Rogers suspicious in Officer Nathan Scott's eyes. They both understood the unspoken reality that had turned a routine drive home into a death sentence. "Your Honor, I want to assure you that this investigation will be thorough and transparent. We've already impounded Officer Scott's patrol car and weapon." Body camera footage is being downloaded and preserved. The scene has been secured and is being processed by our crime scene unit. Body camera footage. Judge Rogers seized on the detail that might provide objective truth in a situation where police reports had historically been exercises in creative writing. Has anyone reviewed that footage yet? Not yet, sir. The download and analysis process takes several hours, and we want to ensure that the chain of custody is properly maintained. Judge Rogers understood the subtext. The footage would be reviewed by police supervisors before anyone else saw it. It would be analyzed by officers who worked alongside Nathan Scott, who shared locker rooms and patrol cars, and the unspoken understanding that officer safety mattered more than civilian lives. The blue wall of silence would have hours to construct a narrative that protected one of their own. Detective Morrison, I want to see my son. Of course, Your Honor. The medical examiner's office has asked that identification be postponed until tomorrow morning, but I can arrange for you to see Kyle if you feel that's necessary. It's necessary. The walk down the hospital corridor seemed to last forever and end too soon. Judge Rogers followed Detective Morrison past rooms where other families waited for news about their loved ones, past medical equipment that hummed with the business of saving lives, toward a room where his son lay beyond the reach of any intervention. Kyle Rogers lay on a gurney in the hospital's family viewing room, covered by a white sheet that couldn't hide the reality of what 3 bullets had done to a young man's body. His face was peaceful, unmarked by violence, looking as though he might wake up at any moment and ask about his constitutional law quiz, scheduled for Thursday morning. Judge Rogers stood beside his son's body and felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Not just grief, though the sorrow was overwhelming. Not just rage, though anger burned through him like acid. What broke was his faith in the system he'd served for more than 2 decades, his belief that justice was possible within institutions that had just murdered his child. Kyle's hands, which had been raised in surrender when Nathan Scott shot him, were folded across his chest. His Georgetown hoodie had been cut away by emergency medical technicians who had tried desperately to save a life that was already lost. The constitutional law textbooks he'd been studying lay in evidence bags beside the gurney, their pages now part of a criminal investigation that would determine whether his death had been justified or criminal. Judge Rogers placed his hand on his son's forehead, the way he used to check for fever when Kyle was young and sick. The skin was cold, already beginning the process of separation that would take his son away from him forever. But the mind behind that forehead, the brilliant legal intellect that had been Kyle's greatest gift, was gone, shot down on a suburban street by an officer who had seen threat instead of promise, danger instead of dreams. "I'm sorry," Detective Morrison said quietly. "I know this is impossible." Judge Rogers didn't respond immediately. He was thinking about the police corruption files spread across his desk at the courthouse, about the systematic pattern of civil rights violations he'd been preparing to address in federal court. Kyle had been shot by an officer who fit the profile perfectly. History of excessive force, pattern of targeting black citizens, protection from department supervisors who valued loyalty over accountability. "Detective Morrison, I want Officer Nathan Scott arrested and charged with murder." "Your Honor, I understand your feelings, but the investigation needs to run its course. Officer Scott has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of our inquiry." Administrative leave. Judge Rogers turned away from his son's body to face the detective directly. "My son is dead, and his killer is at home watching television. Is that your definition of justice?" "Sir, I know this is frustrating, but there are procedures that have to be followed. The district attorney's office will review our findings and make charging decisions based on the evidence." Judge Rogers understood those procedures better than Detective Morrison realized. He'd seen countless cases where officers who killed civilians were protected by internal investigations that prioritized damage control over truth-finding, grand juries that refused to indict, prosecutors who presented cases with all the enthusiasm of defense attorneys, judges who accepted police testimony as gospel truth while treating civilian witnesses as inherently unreliable. The system was designed to protect officers like Nathan Scott, and Kyle Rogers had died because of that protection. "Detective Morrison, I want you to understand something very clearly. This investigation will be conducted properly, or I will ensure that federal authorities take over the case. My son's death will not be covered up, minimized, or explained away. Officer Nathan Scott will face justice, either in your jurisdiction or in mine." Detective Morrison nodded, understanding that she was receiving instructions from a federal judge whose son had just been murdered by one of her colleagues. The political and legal implications were staggering. A high-profile police killing involving the son of the judge presiding over the department's corruption trial would generate national attention and federal oversight. Judge Rogers left the hospital at 12:43 a.m., driving through empty streets toward a home that would never feel the same. Kyle's room would remain exactly as he'd left it. Law school brochures scattered across his desk, clothes folded in drawers, dreams interrupted in the middle of their formation. But Judge Rogers wouldn't be returning to his chambers as the same man who had left them 3 hours earlier. The federal judge who had believed in reform and rehabilitation and the possibility of redemption for corrupt institutions was gone, shot dead on Maple Street along with his son. The man driving home through the pre-dawn darkness was someone else entirely. Someone who understood that justice sometimes required the complete destruction of systems that couldn't be reformed. Someone who had access to federal resources and constitutional authority that could dismantle entire police departments and send corrupt officers to federal prison. Nathan Scott thought he had killed just another young black man whose life didn't matter to anyone with power. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong he was. The reckoning was coming, and it would be delivered by a grieving father who wore black robes and controlled the full power of the federal justice system. Nathan Scott didn't sleep well the night he killed Kyle Rogers. Not because of guilt. Scott had learned to compartmentalize violence as an occupational necessity, but because something felt wrong about the aftermath. Usually, officer-involved shootings followed a predictable pattern: initial investigation, administrative leave, union support, eventual return to duty with commendations for bravery under fire. But this case felt different from the moment Sergeant Williams had run the victim's identification through the system. Scott sat in his apartment kitchen at 6:30 a.m., drinking coffee from a mug that read Thin Blue Line and scrolling through news websites that hadn't yet picked up the story. The police department's media relations office was expert at controlling narrative flow, especially in cases involving officer safety. By the time reporters learned about the shooting, the official story would be fully developed: dangerous suspect, threatening behavior, split-second decision to protect public safety. Scott's phone buzzed with a text from his union representative. Meeting at 8 a.m. Don't talk to anyone before then. Standard procedure. The Fraternal Order of Police had protocols for protecting officers involved in shootings, legal resources that had successfully defended dozens of Scott's colleagues in similar situations. Scott felt confident that this case would follow the same trajectory as all the others. He was wrong. At 7:15 a.m., Lieutenant Marcus Thompson called Scott's personal cell phone, his voice carrying an edge that Scott had never heard before. "Scott, I need you to get down to the station immediately. Don't talk to anyone on your way in. Don't answer your phone. Don't respond to any media inquiries. Just get here now." "Lieutenant, what's going on? My union rep said not to come in until—" "Forget what your union rep said. This is bigger than union protocol. The victim you shot last night? It's Kyle Rogers, Judge Harrison Rogers' son." Scott felt the coffee mug slip from his hands, ceramic shattering against the kitchen floor in a sound that seemed to echo for minutes. Judge Harrison Rogers, the federal judge who was presiding over the department's corruption trial, the judge who had the authority to bring federal charges, to dismantle police departments, to send corrupt officers to federal prison where their badges meant nothing. "Lieutenant, there has to be a mistake. The kid was just some college student driving through." "There's no mistake, Scott. You killed a federal judge's son during a traffic stop. The same federal judge who's been investigating our department for civil rights violations. Do you understand what you've done?" Scott understood. He just created a national news story, a federal case study in police misconduct, a personal vendetta for the most powerful judge in the district. Every excessive force complaint in his personnel file would be scrutinized by federal investigators. Every questionable stop, every use of force incident, every moment when he bent the rules in favor of officer safety would be examined under the harsh light of federal oversight. What do? We follow the script exactly. You were in fear for your life. The suspect made threatening movements. You followed protocol. The shooting was justified. That's the only story anyone hears. Scott dressed quickly, his hands shaking as he buttoned his uniform shirt. The routine that had once felt like putting on armor now felt like preparing for execution. He'd killed suspects before, 2 others in 6 years, both ruled justified shootings by internal affairs. But those victims didn't have fathers who controlled federal courtrooms. The drive to police headquarters took Scott through the University District, where Kyle Rogers had died 12 hours earlier. Crime scene tapes still fluttered around the area where Kyle's Honda Civic had been parked, and Scott could see investigators working methodically through the evidence. Every bullet casing, every drop of blood, every witness statement would be analyzed by people who understood that this case would receive scrutiny, unlike any officer-involved shooting in department history. Scott parked behind the station and entered through the rear entrance, hoping to avoid any media attention that might already be gathering. The hallways felt different than usual, conversations stopping when he walked past, fellow officers looking at him with expressions that mixed sympathy with fear. Everyone understood that Scott's actions had potentially exposed the entire department to federal oversight and criminal prosecution. Lieutenant Thompson was waiting in interview room B, along with Captain Patricia Walsh and someone Scott didn't recognize, a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit who had the bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes legal battles. "Scott, this is Richard Mason from the District Attorney's Office. He's going to walk you through your statement about last night's incident." Mason opened a leather portfolio and spread documents across the interview room table. Scott could see his personnel file, incident reports from previous use-of-force cases, and what appeared to be a timeline of the previous night's events. "Officer Scott, I want to be very clear about the situation we're facing. Kyle Rogers was the son of federal Judge Harrison Rogers, who has been investigating allegations of systematic civil rights violations within this department. The victim was a pre-law student with no criminal record, no history of violence, and no reason to be considered a threat during a routine traffic stop." Scott felt his throat tighten. "Sir, the suspect made threatening movements. I was in fear for my life." "What specific movements did Kyle Rogers make that caused you to feel threatened?" Scott had rehearsed this answer dozens of times during previous internal affairs investigations. He turned toward me suddenly and appeared to be reaching for something in his waistband area. Given the lighting conditions and the suspect's behavior, I reasonably believed he was reaching for a weapon. Mason made notes on a legal pad, his expression suggesting that he'd heard similar explanations before and found them less than convincing. "Officer Scott, you should know that this case will receive federal attention. The FBI will likely take over the investigation within 24 hours. Every aspect of your statement will be verified against physical evidence, witness testimony, and body camera footage." Body camera footage. Scott's confidence wavered slightly. He'd been wearing a department-issued body camera during the traffic stop, but the device had a history of malfunctioning at crucial moments. Scott had learned to position himself in ways that made it difficult for the camera to capture clear footage of suspect interactions. "The body camera footage will support my statement," Scott said, hoping that the dim lighting and camera angle would obscure the details of Kyle Rogers' compliance. Captain Walsh leaned forward, her expression suggesting that Scott's career was balanced on the edge of a knife. "Officer Scott, I need you to understand that this department will support you through this investigation, but only if your actions were justified and within policy. If evidence emerges that contradicts your statement, that support will disappear." The subtext was clear. The department would protect Scott as long as his case could be defended, but they wouldn't sacrifice the entire organization to save one officer who had made an indefensible mistake. Mason continued taking notes, occasionally asking questions that probed for weaknesses in Scott's narrative. How well lit was the area? How many other officers were present? What specific words did Kyle Rogers say during the encounter? Each question was designed to test whether Scott's story would survive federal scrutiny. After 90 minutes of questioning, Mason closed his portfolio and stood to leave. "Officer Scott, you'll be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of both the internal investigation and any federal inquiry that may develop. I strongly advise you to retain private counsel immediately. Private counsel. Scott understood that the district attorney's office was already distancing itself from his case, preparing for the possibility that they might be prosecuting rather than defending him. As the meeting ended, Captain Walsh pulled Scott aside for a private conversation. "Nathan, I need you to understand something. Judge Rogers isn't just any federal judge. He's got a reputation for being tough on police misconduct cases. He's sent officers to federal prison before, and he's not afraid to use his authority to clean house when departments refuse to police themselves."
Captain, I followed protocol. The shooting was justified.
Maybe it was, but justified or not, you've created a situation that threatens everyone in this department. Judge Rogers has been looking for an excuse to impose federal oversight on our operations. You just handed him that excuse on a silver platter. Scott left the station through the same rear entrance he'd used to arrive, but the world outside felt fundamentally different. News vans were setting up in the parking lot across the street. Reporters were already making phone calls, pursuing sources, building the story that would define Scott's legacy and potentially destroy his career. He drove home through streets that felt hostile for the first time in his 6 years of police service. Every black face he saw could be a potential witness, a family member of Kyle Rogers, someone who might recognize him as the officer who had killed an innocent college student. The authority he'd once wielded with confidence now felt like a target painted on his back. Scott's apartment felt like a prison cell when he returned. The television news was already reporting on an officer-involved shooting near the university campus, though Kyle Rogers' identity hadn't been released pending family notification. Scott knew that wouldn't last long. Within hours, every news outlet in the country would be reporting that a federal judge's son had been killed by a police officer during a traffic stop. His phone rang constantly, reporters seeking comment, fellow officers offering support, union representatives coordinating legal strategy. Scott turned off the phone and sat in his living room, staring at the wall where he'd hung commendations from his 6 years of service, certificates of appreciation from community groups, letters of recommendation from supervisors, photos from department award ceremonies. All of it would be meaningless if federal investigators concluded that he'd murdered Kyle Rogers in cold blood. At 2:30 p.m., Scott's doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he could see 2 people in business suits who clearly weren't neighbors making social calls. He opened the door to find FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen and her partner, Special Agent Michael Rodriguez. "Officer Scott, I'm Special Agent Chen with the FBI. We'd like to ask you some questions about the shooting incident involving Kyle Rogers." Scott's training told him to demand a warrant, to insist on legal representation, to invoke his constitutional rights against self-incrimination. But his survival instincts understood that cooperation might be his only chance to avoid federal prosecution. "Agents, I've already given a statement to my department. I'm not sure what additional information I can provide." "We'd like to hear your account of events directly, Officer Scott. This is an informal interview, and you're free to have an attorney present if you prefer." Scott invited the agents into his apartment, understanding that his life was about to be dissected by federal investigators who specialized in police corruption cases. They would examine every arrest he'd made, every report he'd filed, every use of force incident in his career. Kyle Rogers' death would be analyzed within the context of Scott's entire service record. Agent Chen opened a notebook and began asking questions that sounded familiar but carried different weight when delivered by federal investigators. What time did the traffic stop begin? What was Kyle Rogers' demeanor during the encounter? What specific actions led Scott to believe his life was in danger? Scott repeated the same answers he'd given that morning, but the FBI agents asked follow-up questions that probed deeper into his decision-making process. Had Kyle Rogers made any verbal threats? How far away was Scott when he fired his weapon? Were there any witnesses to the incident? "Officer Scott," Agent Rodriguez said, "we've reviewed your service record, and we notice a pattern of use of force incidents involving African-American suspects. Can you explain that pattern?" The question hit Scott like a physical blow. His personnel file contained 14 excessive force complaints, all involving black suspects, all dismissed by internal affairs investigations that prioritized officer safety over civilian rights. Under federal scrutiny, that pattern would be impossible to explain as coincidence. Agent Rodriguez, I work in areas with high crime rates. The demographics of my arrests reflect the demographics of the neighborhoods I patrol. But your use of force rate is significantly higher than other officers working the same areas. How do you account for that discrepancy? Scott felt the walls closing in around him. The FBI agents weren't asking these questions out of curiosity. They were building a case for systematic civil rights violations, a pattern of behavior that would support charges of deliberate misconduct rather than split-second misjudgment. The interview continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Scott's career and the specific circumstances of Kyle Rogers' death. When the agents finally left, Scott understood that his situation was far worse than administrative leave and internal investigation. He was being investigated by the federal government for civil rights violations that could result in decades in federal prison. That evening, Scott watched the news coverage of Kyle Rogers' death with growing horror. Kyle's photograph showed a young man with his father's intelligent eyes, wearing his Georgetown University hoodie, holding law school brochures, and smiling with the confidence of someone who believed the future was bright with possibility. The news anchor described Kyle as an honor student pursuing pre-law studies, planning to follow his father's footsteps into legal service. No mention of gang affiliations, criminal record, or suspicious behavior that might justify a traffic stop. Kyle Rogers had been exactly what he appeared to be, an innocent college student driving home from study group. Scott's phone buzzed with a text from his union representative. Federal prosecutors requesting all personnel files. This is bigger than we anticipated. Recommend immediate private counsel. Nathan Scott turned off the television and sat in darkness, understanding that he'd made the most catastrophic mistake of his career when he decided that Kyle Rogers looked suspicious, driving through his own neighborhood. The young man he'd killed wasn't just another statistic in the war between police and citizens. Kyle Rogers was the son of federal judge Harrison Rogers, and that father was about to use every resource of the federal justice system to ensure that his son's killer faced the full consequences of his actions. The system that had protected Nathan Scott for 6 years was about to meet its maker, and that maker wore black robes and carried the authority to dismantle corrupt police departments, prosecute civil rights violations, and send racist cops to federal prison where their badges couldn't protect them. Nathan Scott was about to learn that some mistakes couldn't be covered up, and some victims had fathers with the power to demand justice from the highest levels of government. The reckoning was coming, and it would be delivered by a grieving father who controlled a federal courtroom. By Thursday morning, Kyle Rogers' death had become a national story. Cable news networks led with footage of the crime scene, interviews with Kyle's professors who described him as brilliant and dedicated to justice, and file photos of federal judge Harrison Rogers entering the courthouse where he would have to recuse himself from cases involving his son's killer. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen stood in the conference room at the federal building's field office, reviewing evidence that painted a picture far different from Officer Nathan Scott's initial statement. The body camera footage, downloaded after a 12-hour delay that raised its own questions, showed Kyle Rogers with his hands clearly visible throughout the entire encounter, following every instruction Scott had given him. The kid never reached for anything, Agent Chen told her partner Michael Rodriguez as they watched the footage for the third time. He had his hands on the car roof when Scott told him to put them there. He turned around with his hands up when Scott screamed at him. At no point did Kyle Rogers make any movement that could reasonably be interpreted as threatening. The footage was damning in its clarity. Kyle Rogers died because Nathan Scott had seen threats that didn't exist, interpreted compliance as resistance, and fired 3 shots at a young man who was following every protocol for surviving police encounters. Agent Rodriguez pulled up Scott's personnel file on his laptop. 14 excessive force complaints in 6 years, all involving black suspects, all dismissed by internal affairs. This isn't a split-second mistake under pressure. This is a pattern of behavior that the department has been protecting. Chen nodded. Understanding that Kyle Rogers' death was the culmination of systematic failures within a police culture that valued officer safety over civilian rights. The department knew they had a problem, officer, and they kept him on the street anyway. Now a federal judge's son is dead because they couldn't be bothered to address obvious warning signs. The FBI investigation had been fast-tracked by direct orders from Washington. When a federal judge's son is killed by police, every resource of the federal justice system gets mobilized to ensure that the case receives appropriate attention. Chen and Rodriguez had been given unlimited resources and clear instructions, determine whether civil rights violations had occurred, and if so, build cases that would hold everyone responsible accountable. Dr. Marcus Williams, the medical examiner who had performed Kyle's autopsy, arrived at the federal building at 10 a.m. to brief the agents on his findings. Dr. Williams was a veteran forensic pathologist who had testified in hundreds of cases involving police use of force, and his reputation for objectivity made his conclusions particularly valuable. Agents, I've completed the autopsy on Kyle Rogers, and the findings are significant, Dr. Williams said, opening a folder containing photographs and diagrams that documented Kyle's injuries. The victim was struck by 3 bullets fired from Officer Scott's service weapon. The first shot entered the chest cavity and would have been immediately incapacitating. The second and third shots were fired after Kyle Rogers was already falling and posed no threat to anyone. Chen leaned forward, understanding the implications. Doctor, are you saying that Officer Scott continued firing after Kyle Rogers was no longer capable of threatening behavior? That's exactly what I'm saying. The trajectory and impact patterns of the wounds indicate that Kyle Rogers was shot once while standing, then twice more as he fell. The second and third shots were unnecessary for officer safety and constitute excessive force under any reasonable standard. Agent Rodriguez made notes on his legal pad, building the case that Nathan Scott had not merely made a mistake, but had committed deliberate acts of violence against a compliant suspect. Doctor, how long would there have been between the first shot and the subsequent shots? Based on the wound patterns and my experience with similar cases, I estimate approximately 2 to 3 seconds between the first shot and the final shot, enough time for a trained officer to assess that the threat had been neutralized and cease firing. The medical evidence corroborated what the body camera footage had shown. Kyle Rogers had been murdered by an officer who continued shooting after any reasonable threat had ended. Nathan Scott hadn't made a split-second decision under pressure. He had executed a young man who was already incapacitated. Chen's phone buzzed with a call from FBI Director Patricia Walsh in Washington. Agent Chen, I'm calling to brief you on additional resources being assigned to the Rogers case. The Attorney General has designated this as a priority investigation under the federal civil rights statutes. Understood, Director. We're building a strong case for criminal civil rights violations. Good, but I need you to understand that this investigation goes beyond Officer Scott. We have credible information that the police department has a pattern of covering up excessive force incidents and protecting officers with histories of misconduct. Your job is to determine whether this is a systemic problem that requires federal intervention. Chen understood the broader implications. Kyle Rogers' death could trigger a consent decree that would place the entire police department under federal oversight, with court-appointed monitors ensuring that constitutional rights were protected during police encounters. At 2 p.m., Chen and Rodriguez interviewed Kyle's study group partners at the university library, where he had spent his final evening alive. The students painted a picture of a young man passionate about criminal justice reform, someone who believed that the legal system could be improved through dedicated service and careful application of constitutional principles. Kyle was always talking about following his dad's footsteps into law, said Jennifer Martinez, a classmate who had studied constitutional law with Kyle for 2 years. But he wanted to work on police accountability cases. He thought the system could be reformed if good people got involved and demanded better. The irony was devastating. Kyle Rogers had died at the hands of the very system he had hoped to reform, killed by an officer whose pattern of excessive force should have been addressed years earlier by supervisors who chose protection over accountability. Agent Rodriguez showed the students photographs from the crime scene, including images of Kyle's constitutional law textbooks scattered around his Honda Civic. "Can you tell us what Kyle was studying the night he was killed?" Jennifer recognized the textbook immediately. "That's our constitutional law book. We were studying the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause for Thursday's quiz. Kyle was particularly interested in how the amendment was supposed to protect citizens from government abuse." Chen felt the weight of tragic irony. Kyle Rogers had died while studying constitutional protections that should have prevented his own death, killed by an officer who had never been held accountable for previous violations of those same constitutional principles. Meanwhile, across town at police headquarters, Chief Michael Patterson was meeting with his command staff to address the growing crisis. The FBI investigation, media attention, and political pressure from city officials had created a perfect storm that threatened to destroy careers and expose decades of problematic policing practices. "Gentlemen," Chief Patterson said, addressing the lieutenants and captains who supervised patrol operations, "we have a situation that could result in federal oversight of this entire department. Officer Scott's actions have brought scrutiny that extends far beyond this single incident." Lieutenant Thompson, Scott's immediate supervisor, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Chief, Scott followed his training. He perceived a threat and responded according to protocol." Marcus, Scott killed a federal judge's son during what should have been a routine traffic stop. There was no threat. There was no justification. And now we have FBI agents examining every use of force incident in this department for the past decade. Captain Walsh, who had overseen internal affairs investigations that dismissed Scott's previous complaints, understood that her own career was now at risk. "Chief, what are our options?" "Our options are limited. We cooperate fully with the federal investigation, hope that Scott's actions can be characterized as an isolated incident, and pray that the FBI doesn't find evidence of systematic civil rights violations." The truth, which everyone in the room understood but no one wanted to acknowledge, was that the department had protected officers like Nathan Scott for years. Excessive force complaints had been dismissed without serious investigation. Officers with histories of misconduct had been transferred rather than terminated. The culture of protection that kept bad officers on the street had finally produced a consequence that couldn't be managed or minimized. At 4 p.m., FBI agents arrived at police headquarters with a federal warrant to seize Scott's personnel file, along with records of all use-of-force incidents, citizen complaints, and internal affairs investigations for the past 5 years. The warrant was signed by federal Judge Catherine Morrison, who had been assigned to the case after Judge Rogers recused himself. Agent Chen personally supervised the evidence collection, ensuring that no documents disappeared or were altered before federal review. The paper trail would tell the story of a department that had repeatedly ignored warning signs and protected an officer who should have been terminated years earlier. "Chief Patterson," Agent Chen said, "I need to inform you that this investigation will examine whether the department's handling of previous complaints against Officer Scott contributed to Kyle Rogers' death. If we find evidence that supervisors ignored obvious problems, those supervisors will face federal charges." The message was clear. Everyone who had protected Nathan Scott was now at risk of criminal prosecution for civil rights violations. As evening approached, Judge Harrison Rogers sat in his chambers, officially recused from all cases involving the police department, but privately coordinating with federal prosecutors to ensure that his son's case received appropriate attention. The police corruption trial he had been preparing was now secondary to the federal investigation of Kyle's death. Judge Rogers had spent the day reviewing FBI reports, autopsy findings, and body camera footage that documented his son's final moments. The evidence was overwhelming. Kyle had been murdered by an officer who saw compliance as resistance and fear as justification for violence. His secure phone rang at 6:15 p.m. The caller was United States Attorney General Patricia Morrison, calling from Washington to brief him on the federal response to Kyle's death. "Judge Rogers, I want you to know that this case has the full attention of the Justice Department. We're treating Kyle's death as a federal civil rights violation, and we're prepared to bring charges against everyone who contributed to this tragedy. General Morrison, I appreciate the attention this case is receiving, but I need to know that it won't be treated as an isolated incident. My son died because of systematic failures that have been protecting bad officers for years. Judge Rogers, I can assure you that our investigation will examine the entire culture that made Kyle's death possible. If we find evidence of deliberate indifference to civil rights violations, we'll seek a consent decree that places the department under federal oversight. Judge Rogers felt a measure of satisfaction that federal resources were being mobilized to address the systematic problems that had cost his son's life. Kyle's death would not be in vain if it resulted in reforms that protected other young people from officers like Nathan Scott. As night fell over the city, Nathan Scott sat in his apartment, watching news coverage that painted him as a racist killer who had murdered an innocent college student. His union representative had advised him to avoid media interviews, but the narrative was being written without his input. Kyle Rogers was being portrayed as a brilliant young man with a bright future, while Scott was characterized as a rogue officer with a history of excessive force. Scott's phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters seeking comment, family members offering support, and fellow officers who were either standing by him or distancing themselves from the controversy. The thin blue line that had once protected him was fracturing under federal pressure. At 11 p.m., Scott received a call from his attorney, a criminal defense lawyer who specialized in representing police officers facing serious charges. Nathan, I've been reviewing the evidence in your case, and I need to be honest with you. The body camera footage is devastating. The autopsy shows that you continued firing after Kyle Rogers was incapacitated. The FBI has evidence of a pattern of excessive force that suggests deliberate civil rights violations. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that federal prosecutors are building a case that could put you in prison for the rest of your life. Civil rights violations resulting in death carry potential life sentences. You need to start thinking about whether you want to cooperate with the investigation. Scott felt his world collapsing. The system that had protected him for 6 years was abandoning him to federal justice, and the father of his victim had the resources and authority to ensure that justice was delivered with maximum force. Kyle Rogers' death was becoming the catalyst for federal intervention that would transform policing in the city, and Nathan Scott was about to become the symbol of everything wrong with officers who valued power over service. The investigation was just beginning, but the outcome was already clear. Nathan Scott would face the full consequences of his actions, and the system that had enabled those actions would be dismantled by federal authority. Justice was coming, delivered by FBI agents who answered to a grieving father with the power to demand accountability from the highest levels of government. The first crack in the police department's wall of silence came from an unexpected source, Officer Maria Santos, a 5-year veteran who had witnessed Nathan Scott's pattern of excessive force, but had never found the courage to report it. Kyle Rogers' death changed everything for Santos, who could no longer reconcile her oath to protect and serve with her silence about Scott's behavior. Santos walked into FBI agent Sarah Chen's field office on Friday morning, 3 days after Kyle's death, carrying a manila folder that would accelerate the federal investigation beyond anything Scott's supporters had anticipated. Agent Chen, I'm Officer Maria Santos, with Metro Police. I have information about Nathan Scott that you need to see. Santos opened her folder to reveal photographs, incident reports, and handwritten notes documenting Scott's conduct during arrests she had witnessed as his backup officer. The evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse that Internal Affairs had either ignored or actively covered up. Officer Santos, why are you coming forward now? Because Kyle Rogers could have been my nephew, my brother, any young man I care about. I watched Scott brutalize suspects for years, and I stayed quiet because I thought that's how the system worked. But Kyle Rogers was studying constitutional law when Scott killed him. He was trying to make the system better, and the system murdered him for it. The documents Santos provided were devastating. Photographs of suspects with injuries that didn't match the force described in official reports. Witness statements that contradicted Scott's version of events. Evidence of supervisors who had been notified about Scott's behavior but took no corrective action. This report is from January, Agent Chen said, reviewing a complaint about Scott choking a teenager during a traffic stop. Internal Affairs ruled it unfounded, but your photographs show clear evidence of assault. Internal Affairs never interviewed the witnesses I identified. They never examined the medical records I flagged. They took Scott's word against a 17-year-old kid's word and closed the case. Agent Chen understood that Officer Santos was providing evidence of deliberate indifference, a pattern of ignoring civil rights violations that would support federal charges against supervisory personnel. Kyle Rogers' death was not an isolated incident, but the predictable result of a system that protected bad officers. Officer Santos, are you willing to testify before a federal grand jury about what you witnessed? Yes, ma'am. Kyle Rogers died because I was too afraid to speak up earlier. I won't let that happen to anyone else. Word of Santos's cooperation spread through police headquarters like wildfire. By noon, 3 other officers had contacted the FBI to report their own observations of Scott's misconduct. The thin blue line was cracking under the weight of federal investigation and the moral pressure of Kyle Rogers' death. Meanwhile, Scott's attorney was meeting with federal prosecutors to explore plea negotiations that might spare his client a life sentence. The evidence against Scott was overwhelming, but prosecutors were more interested in information about supervisors who had enabled his behavior than in maximum punishment for a single officer. Mr. Davidson, federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, told Scott's attorney, "Your client is facing civil rights charges that carry potential life imprisonment. However, we're prepared to consider reduced charges in exchange for cooperation regarding supervisory misconduct." What kind of cooperation are you seeking? We want your client to testify about instructions he received from supervisors regarding use of force, any conversations about covering up excessive force incidents, and any knowledge he has about patterns of misconduct within the department. Davidson understood that prosecutors were building a case against the entire command structure that had protected Scott. I'll need to discuss this with my client, but I should point out that Officer Scott followed training he received from department supervisors. If that training involved civil rights violations, then those supervisors are going to face federal charges. Your client can either be a witness or a co-conspirator. The message was clear. Scott could reduce his sentence by cooperating against his former colleagues, or he could face the maximum penalty for his crimes. Federal prosecutors were more interested in dismantling the system that had enabled Kyle Rogers' death than in destroying any single officer. Back at police headquarters, Chief Patterson was meeting with city attorneys to discuss the department's liability exposure. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that would likely result in massive civil lawsuits from Scott's previous victims, along with wrongful death claims from Kyle Rogers' family. Chief, we're looking at potential settlements in the tens of millions, City Attorney Robert Chen told Patterson. Every excessive force case that Internal Affairs dismissed is going to be re-examined by federal investigators and civil rights lawyers. What are our options? Our options are to cooperate fully with the federal investigation and hope for a negotiated consent decree that allows the city to maintain some control over police operations, or to fight the charges and risk having a federal judge impose monitoring that could last for decades. Patterson understood that Kyle Rogers' death had triggered consequences that would transform policing in the city, regardless of what happened to Nathan Scott. The federal government had decided that the department could not be trusted to police itself, and federal oversight was inevitable. At 3 p.m., FBI agents executed search warrants at the homes of Lieutenant Marcus Thompson and Captain Patricia Walsh, seeking evidence of their knowledge about Scott's pattern of misconduct. The searches sent a clear message to department supervisors. Federal investigators considered them potential co-conspirators rather than witnesses. Agent Rodriguez supervised the search of Thompson's home, looking for communications that might reveal his knowledge of Scott's excessive force complaints. What they found was even more damaging. Email conversations with other supervisors discussing strategies for protecting Scott from Internal Affairs investigations. One email, sent 6 months before Kyle's death, was particularly damning. Scott's got another excessive force complaint from that traffic stop on Riverside. Kid claims Scott choked him, but the kid's got a record. We can probably make this go away if we emphasize officer safety and question the complainant's credibility. The email was signed by Thompson and copied to Captain Walsh and 2 other supervisors. It provided clear evidence that command staff had deliberately protected Scott despite knowing about his pattern of misconduct. Dr. Patricia Williams, a criminal justice professor at the university Kyle had attended, was contacted by federal investigators to provide expert analysis of the department's internal affairs processes. Dr. Williams had studied police accountability for 20 years and had testified in numerous federal civil rights cases. Agents, what you're describing is a textbook example of deliberate indifference, Dr. Williams told Chen and Rodriguez. When supervisors repeatedly dismiss excessive force complaints without adequate investigation, they create an environment where officers understand that misconduct will be tolerated. Dr. Williams, in your expert opinion, was Kyle Rogers' death a predictable result of the department's practices? Absolutely. When you protect officers who abuse their authority, you send a message that constitutional rights don't matter. Kyle Rogers died because Nathan Scott learned that he could use excessive force without consequences. The expert testimony would be crucial for federal prosecutors seeking to prove that supervisory personnel had created the conditions that led to Kyle's death. The case was expanding beyond Nathan Scott to encompass the entire culture of protection that had enabled his behavior. Judge Harrison Rogers, officially recused from the case, but privately monitoring its progress, received regular briefings from federal prosecutors about the expanding investigation. Each new piece of evidence confirmed what he had suspected for years. The police department had systematic problems that required federal intervention. At 7 p.m., Judge Rogers received a call from Kyle's mother, his ex-wife, Dr. Patricia Rogers, who had driven in from Atlanta, where she worked as a pediatric surgeon. Harrison, I've been following the news coverage, and I need to know that Kyle's death is going to mean something. I need to know that other mothers won't go through what I'm going through. Patricia, the federal investigation is uncovering evidence of systematic civil rights violations. Kyle's death is going to result in federal oversight that will transform how police interact with the community. I don't want revenge, Harrison. I want change. I want Kyle's death to protect other young people from officers like Nathan Scott. Judge Rogers understood that his ex-wife was expressing the same goal that motivated his own actions, ensuring that Kyle's death catalyzed reforms that would prevent similar tragedies. Their son's life would have meaning if his death resulted in constitutional policing that protected all citizens. As the weekend approached, Nathan Scott sat in his apartment, watching news coverage that documented the expanding federal investigation. Fellow officers who had once protected him were now cooperating with federal investigators. Supervisors who had dismissed his excessive force complaints were facing potential federal charges. Scott's attorney called at 8 p.m. with an update on plea negotiations. Nathan, federal prosecutors are offering to reduce charges to involuntary manslaughter in exchange for your cooperation against Lieutenant Thompson and Captain Walsh. You'd serve 8 to 10 years instead of life in prison. What kind of cooperation? They want you to testify that Thompson and Walsh instructed you to use aggressive tactics during traffic stops, that they told you excessive force complaints would be handled internally, and that they created an environment where you believed constitutional violations would be protected. Scott understood that accepting the plea would require him to admit that his actions were criminal rather than justified, that Kyle Rogers had been murdered rather than killed in self-defense. But the alternative was spending the rest of his life in federal prison. Do I have a choice? Not really. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and federal prosecutors are more interested in the supervisors who enabled your behavior than in maximum punishment for you personally. Scott's world was collapsing around him. The system that had protected him for 6 years was sacrificing him to federal justice, and his only option was to cooperate against the supervisors who had taught him that excessive force was acceptable as long as it didn't generate political problems. By Sunday evening, local news stations were reporting that multiple police supervisors were under federal investigation for civil rights violations. The story had evolved from a single officer-involved shooting to a systematic examination of police culture that threatened careers throughout the department. Community activist groups, led by Kyle's former professors and classmates, organized vigils and protests demanding federal oversight of police operations. The demonstrations were peaceful but persistent, with speakers emphasizing that Kyle Rogers had died studying the constitutional principles that should have protected him. Kyle Rogers was killed by the system he wanted to reform. Professor Martinez told a crowd gathered outside the courthouse where Judge Rogers normally presided. His death shows us that reform isn't enough. We need federal intervention to ensure that constitutional rights are protected during every police encounter. The political pressure was building from multiple directions. Federal prosecutors seeking criminal charges, civil rights lawyers preparing massive lawsuits, community groups demanding accountability, and media coverage that had made Kyle Rogers' death a symbol of everything wrong with police culture. Chief Patterson understood that his department was facing an existential crisis. Federal oversight was inevitable. Multiple supervisors would face criminal charges, and the culture of protection that had defined police operations for decades was being dismantled by investigators who answered to Kyle Rogers' father. The institutional unraveling that began with Nathan Scott's traffic stop was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control it. Kyle Rogers' death had triggered consequences that would transform policing in the city, and those changes would be implemented under the supervision of federal authorities who had the power to ensure compliance. Nathan Scott had killed the wrong young man, and now the system that had protected him was sacrificing him to save itself from complete federal takeover. The reckoning that Judge Harrison Rogers had promised was arriving with the full force of federal authority behind it. Justice was coming, and it would be delivered by FBI agents, federal prosecutors, and federal judges who understood that Kyle Rogers had died because local authorities had failed to protect constitutional rights. The system was unraveling, and Nathan Scott was about to learn that some mistakes destroy not just individual careers, but entire institutions that have lost the moral authority to police themselves. Chapter 6: The Weight of Truth. The federal grand jury convened on Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Kyle Rogers had been murdered while studying constitutional law. The timing wasn't lost on anyone involved. A week that had begun with a young man preparing for his future had ended with federal prosecutors preparing to dismantle the system that had destroyed that future. United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh stood before 23 citizens who would decide whether Nathan Scott and his supervisors would face federal criminal charges. The evidence she was about to present would document not just Kyle's death, but a pattern of civil rights violations that had been protected by deliberate indifference from command staff. Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, you are here to consider evidence in the death of Kyle Rogers, a 20-year-old pre-law student who was killed by Officer Nathan Scott during a traffic stop that should never have escalated to violence. But this case is about more than one officer's actions. It's about a system that enabled those actions by protecting an officer with a documented history of excessive force. Walsh projected the first piece of evidence onto screens around the grand jury room, Kyle's driver's license photo, showing a young man with intelligent eyes and his father's confident smile. The jurors would need to remember that Kyle Rogers had been a person with dreams and potential, not just a statistic in a police report. Kyle Rogers was driving home from study group when Officer Nathan Scott decided that a young black man in a Honda Civic looked suspicious. Kyle complied with every instruction Scott gave him. He kept his hands visible, moved slowly, spoke respectfully, and followed protocols that should have kept him safe. Despite perfect compliance, Kyle Rogers was shot 3 times and left to die on the street. The body camera footage played without sound, allowing jurors to see Kyle's compliance and Scott's escalation without the distraction of audio. The visual evidence was devastating. Kyle with his hands on the car roof, Kyle turning around with his hands raised, Kyle falling after the first shot, Scott firing 2 additional shots into a young man who was already incapacitated. Grand juror Patricia Martinez, a mother of 2 college-age sons, felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched Kyle Rogers die. The young man on the screen could have been her son, driving home from study group, following every rule his parents had taught him about surviving police encounters. The medical examiner will testify that Kyle Rogers was shot once while standing, then twice more as he fell. Officer Scott had 2 to 3 seconds between the first shot and the final shot, enough time to assess that any threat had ended, but he chose to continue firing. Dr. Marcus Williams took the witness stand to describe Kyle's injuries with clinical precision that couldn't hide the brutality of what had occurred. The first gunshot wound to the chest would have been immediately incapacitating. The victim would have lost consciousness within seconds and posed no threat to anyone. The subsequent shots were unnecessary and constitute excessive force under any reasonable standard. Walsh projected autopsy photographs that showed the trajectory of each bullet, the damage to Kyle's organs, the evidence that he had been shot while falling. The grand jurors absorbed the medical testimony with expressions of growing horror and anger. Ladies and gentlemen, Kyle Rogers didn't die because Officer Scott made a split-second mistake under pressure. Kyle Rogers was executed by an officer who continued shooting after any reasonable threat had ended. The prosecution then turned to evidence of systematic misconduct. Officer Maria Santos testified about witnessing Scott's excessive force during previous arrests, about supervisors who had been notified but took no action, about a culture that valued officer protection over constitutional rights. I watched Officer Scott choke a teenager during a traffic stop in January. Santos testified, her voice steady despite the weight of her revelations. The kid was handcuffed and compliant, but Scott put him in a chokehold because he thought the kid was being disrespectful. I reported it to Lieutenant Thompson, and he told me that kids need to learn respect for authority. Email evidence obtained from Lieutenant Thompson's home computer was entered into the grand jury record, showing deliberate efforts to protect Scott from accountability. The emails documented a pattern of dismissed complaints, ignored witness statements, and strategies for protecting an officer whose supervisors knew was problematic. One email exchange between Thompson and Captain Walsh was particularly damning. Thompson, Scott's got another excessive force complaint. Kid claims illegal chokehold during arrest. Walsh standard response. Emphasize officer safety. Question complainant credibility. Scott's arrest stats are good for our numbers. Thompson, understood, will handle through normal channels. Grand juror Robert Chen, a retired teacher, read the email exchange with disgust. The casual tone of supervisors discussing how to cover up civil rights violations revealed a culture where constitutional rights were secondary to protecting officers and maintaining arrest statistics. Expert witness Dr. Patricia Williams testified about deliberate indifference and its role in creating environments where excessive force becomes normalized. When supervisors repeatedly dismiss complaints without adequate investigation, they send a clear message to officers that misconduct will be tolerated. Kyle Rogers died because Nathan Scott learned that he could abuse his authority without consequences. The grand jury heard testimony from Scott's previous victims, people who had been choked, beaten, and humiliated during encounters that had been ruled justified by internal affairs investigations. Their stories painted a picture of an officer who saw compliance as disrespect and constitutional rights as obstacles to police authority. Marcus Johnson, a college student who had been beaten by Scott 6 months earlier, testified about his encounter with obvious emotion. Officer Scott pulled me over for a broken taillight, then dragged me out of the car and beat me unconscious because he said I was being hostile. I was saying yes sir and no sir, but he kept escalating until he put me in the hospital. Did you file a complaint? Walsh asked. Yes, ma'am. Internal Affairs told me that Officer Scott felt threatened by my behavior and that his use of force was justified. They said if I pursued the complaint, they would investigate me for assaulting an officer. The pattern was clear. Scott had been protected by a system that prioritized officer safety over citizen rights, that dismissed complaints without serious investigation, that allowed constitutional violations to continue until they inevitably resulted in Kyle Rogers' death. FBI agent Sarah Chen testified about the department's internal affairs process, describing how complaints were routinely dismissed without interviewing witnesses, examining medical records, or conducting thorough investigations. The department's Internal Affairs Division functioned as a protection service for officers rather than an accountability mechanism for citizens. The grand jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning indictments. Nathan Scott was charged with federal civil rights violations resulting in death, charges that carried potential life imprisonment. Lieutenant Thompson and Captain Walsh were charged with conspiracy to violate civil rights and deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. The indictments sent shockwaves through police headquarters. Officers who had once felt protected by the thin blue line now understood that federal prosecutors could reach anyone who had participated in covering up constitutional violations. Chief Patterson held an emergency press conference to address the indictments, standing before cameras with the hollow expression of someone whose career was ending in disgrace. The indictments handed down today represent a dark chapter in this department's history. We will cooperate fully with federal authorities to ensure that justice is served. Reporter Sarah Kim raised her hand with the question everyone wanted answered. Chief Patterson, did you know about Officer Scott's history of excessive force complaints? I was aware that Officer Scott had been the subject of some complaints, but those complaints were investigated by Internal Affairs and found to be without merit. Chief, are you saying that you trusted Internal Affairs investigations that federal prosecutors have characterized as deliberately inadequate? Patterson had no good answer. Any response would either admit to incompetence or complicity in civil rights violations. I have no further comment at this time. The press conference ended with Patterson walking away from questions about his own knowledge of systematic misconduct. Within hours, federal investigators would be examining his communications and decision-making processes to determine whether he had also participated in protecting officers who violated constitutional rights. Nathan Scott learned about his indictment while sitting in his apartment, watching news coverage that described him as facing potential life imprisonment for civil rights violations. His attorney called 20 minutes later with confirmation that plea negotiations had ended unsuccessfully. Nathan, federal prosecutors withdrew their plea offer after the grand jury voted to indict. They're confident in their case and want to make an example of you. What does that mean? It means you're going to trial for federal civil rights violations resulting in death. If convicted, you could spend the rest of your life in prison. Scott's world collapsed completely. The system that had protected him for 6 years had abandoned him to federal justice, and the father of his victim had marshaled resources that would ensure maximum prosecution. Kyle Rogers' death was being treated as a federal crime that demanded the harshest possible punishment. Judge Harrison Rogers watched news coverage of the indictments from his chambers, feeling a measure of satisfaction that federal prosecutors were treating his son's death with appropriate seriousness. The charges against Scott and his supervisors represented accountability that local authorities had never been willing to provide. But indictments were just the beginning. Kyle's death had triggered a federal investigation that would result in a consent decree placing the entire police department under federal oversight. Constitutional policing would be enforced by federal monitors who answered to federal judges rather than local politics. Dr. Patricia Rogers called her ex-husband from Atlanta, where she had been following news coverage of the case. Harrison, I saw the news about the indictments. Is this going to be enough? Patricia, the criminal charges are just part of the federal response. The Justice Department is also pursuing a consent decree that will transform how police operate in this city. Kyle's death is going to result in changes that protect other young people from officers like Nathan Scott. I keep thinking about Kyle studying constitutional law that night. He believed the system could be reformed if good people worked to make it better. Kyle was right, Patricia. The system can be reformed, but sometimes it takes federal intervention to force that reform. Our son's death is going to make constitutional policing a reality in this city. As evening approached, Kyle Rogers' former classmates gathered at the university library where he had spent his final night studying. They had organized a memorial study session focused on the constitutional principles Kyle had been learning when he was killed. Jennifer Martinez read from Kyle's constitutional law textbook, the same edition that had been scattered around his Honda Civic. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under law for all citizens. It was designed to ensure that government officials, including police officers, cannot deny constitutional rights based on race or other protected characteristics. The students spent 3 hours studying constitutional law in Kyle's memory, learning about the legal principles that should have protected him from Nathan Scott's violence. Their commitment to understanding and defending constitutional rights would be Kyle's living legacy. Nathan Scott spent that same evening packing personal belongings, understanding that his apartment would soon be beyond his financial reach. Legal fees, unemployment, and civil lawsuit exposure would consume whatever resources he had accumulated during 6 years of police service. His phone rang once, a call from Officer Maria Santos. "Nathan, I want you to know that I'm sorry it came to this, but Kyle Rogers deserved better than what you gave him." Santos hung up before Scott could respond, leaving him alone with the reality that even his fellow officers now saw him as a criminal rather than a colleague. The thin blue line had dissolved under federal pressure, and Scott was facing the consequences of his actions without institutional protection. The weight of truth was falling on everyone who had participated in the system that enabled Kyle Rogers' death. Nathan Scott would face federal trial for murder. His supervisors would face charges for protecting him. The department would face federal oversight that would transform police culture. Justice was coming, delivered by federal prosecutors who answered to Kyle Rogers' father and understood that constitutional rights were not negotiable. The system that had protected Nathan Scott was being dismantled by federal authority, and accountability was being imposed from the highest levels of government. Kyle Rogers' death would not be in vain. His name would be remembered as the catalyst for federal intervention that finally made constitutional policing a reality rather than just a constitutional promise. The federal courthouse had never seen security measures like those implemented for Nathan Scott's trial. FBI agents screened every visitor, metal detectors operated at maximum sensitivity, and federal marshals maintained perimeters that reflected the national attention focused on a case that had become a symbol of police accountability. Judge Catherine Morrison entered courtroom 6B at exactly 9 a.m. on Monday, November 15th, wearing the black robes that represented federal authority over local police misconduct. Judge Morrison had been selected specifically for her expertise in civil rights cases and her reputation for holding law enforcement accountable to constitutional standards. The defendant's table held Nathan Scott, dressed in a Navy suit that couldn't hide his transformation from confident police officer to federal criminal defendant. His attorney, Robert Davidson, had prepared the best defense possible for an officer caught on camera executing a compliant suspect, but they both understood that the evidence was overwhelming. At the prosecutor's table, United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh organized documents that would document not just Kyle Rogers' death, but the systematic civil rights violations that had made that death inevitable. Federal prosecutors had unlimited resources and clear instructions, secure convictions that would send a message about constitutional policing. The courtroom gallery was packed with federal officials, media representatives, civil rights activists, and members of Kyle Rogers' family. Dr. Patricia Rogers sat in the front row, having flown in from Atlanta to witness the trial of her son's killer. Judge Harrison Rogers occupied a seat near the back, officially present as a private citizen rather than a federal judge. The jury selection had taken 3 days, with federal prosecutors seeking citizens who understood that police officers were not above the law, while defense attorneys looked for jurors who might sympathize with the split-second decisions required in law enforcement. The final jury consisted of 12 citizens who had sworn to judge the case based on evidence rather than emotion or bias. "Your Honor," Walsh announced during opening statements, "the evidence will show that Nathan Scott murdered Kyle Rogers in cold blood, shooting him 3 times during a traffic stop where Kyle complied with every instruction and posed no threat to anyone. This was not a split-second decision under pressure. This was an execution carried out by an officer who had learned that he could abuse his authority without consequences." Walsh walked to a large screen that displayed Kyle Rogers' driver's license photo, showing a young man with intelligent eyes and his father's confident smile. Kyle Rogers was 20 years old, an honor student studying constitutional law at the State University. He was driving home from study group when Officer Nathan Scott decided that a young black man in a Honda Civic looked suspicious enough to warrant a traffic stop. The prosecutor continued, her voice building intensity as she described the events that led to Kyle's death. Kyle Rogers did everything right. He pulled over immediately when Officer Scott activated his emergency lights. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel. He spoke respectfully and followed every instruction Scott gave him. Kyle Rogers was the model citizen that police training manuals describe as compliant and non-threatening. The body camera footage played for the jury on large screens that made Kyle's compliance and Scott's escalation impossible to miss. Jurors watched a young man follow every protocol for surviving police encounters, only to be shot down by an officer who interpreted cooperation as resistance. Walsh pointed to the screen where Kyle Rogers stood with his hands raised in surrender. Ladies and gentlemen, you are watching a murder. Kyle Rogers is following every instruction Officer Scott gave him, and Scott shoots him anyway. Then, while Kyle is falling, Scott fires 2 more shots into a young man who is already dying. The footage was devastating in its clarity. Kyle's hands remained visible throughout the entire encounter. His movements were deliberate and careful, and his compliance was perfect until Scott decided to shoot him. Several jurors wiped away tears as they watched a young man die for no reason other than an officer's prejudice and poor training. Defense attorney Davidson attempted to argue self-defense, claiming that Scott had perceived threats that justified his actions. Officer Scott feared for his life, Davidson told the jury. In the darkness, with a suspect making sudden movements, Scott made the split-second decision that police training requires to protect public safety. Davidson's argument struggled against the visual evidence that contradicted every claim of threatening behavior. Ladies and gentlemen, police officers must make life and death decisions in seconds, often with incomplete information and under extreme stress. Officer Scott believed he saw Kyle Rogers reaching for a weapon, and his training required him to respond immediately to protect himself and the public. But the argument fell apart when federal prosecutors played the footage in slow motion, showing Kyle's hands remained visible throughout the encounter. His movements were deliberate and careful, and his compliance was perfect, until Scott decided to shoot him. Dr. Marcus Williams, the medical examiner, testified about Kyle's autopsy findings with clinical precision that destroyed any claim of justified shooting. The first bullet would have incapacitated Kyle Rogers immediately. He would have lost consciousness within seconds and posed no threat to anyone. The second and third shots were fired while he was falling and posed no threat. Officer Scott had ample time to assess that the threat had ended, but chose to continue shooting. Dr. Williams displayed autopsy photographs and diagrams that showed the trajectory of each bullet, documenting how Kyle had been shot once while standing, then twice more as he fell. The pattern of injuries indicates that Officer Scott continued firing after Kyle Rogers was already incapacitated. This constitutes excessive force under any reasonable standard. Officer Maria Santos testified about witnessing Scott's pattern of excessive force, her voice steady as she described incidents that had been covered up by supervisors who valued officer protection over constitutional rights. I watched Officer Scott brutalize suspects for years, Santos told the jury. He would escalate encounters until he could justify violence. Then supervisors would protect him by dismissing complaints. I reported his behavior to Lieutenant Thompson multiple times, but nothing ever happened. Kyle Rogers died because Nathan Scott learned that he could commit acts of violence and call it officer safety. Santos described specific incidents where she had witnessed Scott choking suspects, beating handcuffed arrestees, and using racial slurs during arrests. Officer Scott once told me that these people needed to learn respect for authority, and that sometimes you had to teach them through pain. He said internal affairs would always back us up as long as we claimed we feared for our lives. The prosecution called Kyle's study group partners to testify about his character and aspirations, painting a picture of a young man dedicated to criminal justice reform who had been killed by the system he hoped to improve. Kyle was passionate about police accountability. Jennifer Martinez testified. He believed that good officers and strong oversight could eliminate misconduct. He was studying constitutional law the night he was killed, learning about protections that should have saved his life. Kyle wanted to be a prosecutor who held bad cops accountable while supporting officers who served their communities with integrity. Martinez described Kyle's academic excellence, his volunteer work with legal aid clinics, and his plans to attend Georgetown Law School to study civil rights law. Kyle Rogers was everything we want young people to be: educated, dedicated to justice, and committed to making the system better through legal reform. Federal prosecutors introduced evidence of Scott's previous excessive force incidents, showing a pattern of violence against black suspects that had been systematically covered up by department supervisors. The pattern evidence demonstrated deliberate misconduct rather than mistaken judgment. Marcus Johnson, the college student Scott had beaten 6 months before Kyle's death, testified about his encounter with obvious emotion. "Officer Scott beat me unconscious for asking why I was being arrested. When I filed a complaint, Internal Affairs threatened to charge me with assaulting an officer. Lieutenant Thompson told me that if I pursued the complaint, they would investigate my background and find reasons to arrest me." Johnson's testimony was supported by medical records showing injuries consistent with police brutality, photographs of his beaten face, and audio recordings of his Internal Affairs interview where investigators coached him to withdraw his complaint. "The system protected Officer Scott and silenced me," Johnson continued. "I was afraid to speak up again until Kyle Rogers was killed. Then I realized that my silence might have contributed to his death." The federal prosecutors played audio recordings of Internal Affairs interviews where investigators coached Scott on how to justify his actions, providing explicit evidence of the conspiracy to violate civil rights that had enabled Kyle's death. In one recording, Internal Affairs Sergeant Patricia Williams could be heard telling Scott, "Remember, you feared for your life. The suspect made threatening movements. You followed your training. Keep it simple, and we'll handle the paperwork." Federal prosecutors introduced evidence of Scott's social media posts, revealing racist attitudes that explained his willingness to see threats where none existed. Posts mocking Black Lives Matter protesters, sharing memes about police violence, and expressing contempt for thugs who needed to learn respect. "Officer Scott," Walsh continued during cross-examination, "do you recognize this Facebook post where you wrote, 'Maybe if these thugs followed instructions instead of acting tough, they wouldn't get shot'?" Scott's attorney objected, but Judge Morrison allowed the evidence as probative of Scott's state of mind and racial bias. The social media posts revealed an officer who saw young black men as inherent threats requiring violent suppression. Expert witness Dr. Patricia Williams testified about implicit bias and its role in police shootings, explaining how officers like Scott had been conditioned to see black citizens as dangerous regardless of their actual behavior. Officer Scott shot Kyle Rogers because his training and personal prejudices led him to interpret compliance as resistance. Dr. Williams explained, "This is a documented pattern in police shootings where officers claim to fear for their lives while shooting unarmed, compliant citizens. The fear is real, but it's based on racial bias rather than actual threat assessment." On Wednesday morning, Nathan Scott took the witness stand in his own defense, a desperate attempt to humanize a defendant who had been portrayed as a racist killer. His testimony began with his background and training, trying to establish that he was a dedicated officer rather than a criminal. "I joined the police force to serve and protect the community," Scott testified. "Every decision I made that night was based on my training and my assessment of threat to public safety. I never intended to hurt anyone who wasn't threatening me or others." Under cross-examination, federal prosecutor Jennifer Walsh systematically destroyed Scott's credibility by confronting him with body camera footage that contradicted his testimony. "Officer Scott, you testified that Kyle Rogers made threatening movements. Please point to any moment in this footage where Kyle Rogers made a threatening movement." Scott stared at the screen, showing Kyle's perfect compliance, unable to identify any behavior that could reasonably be interpreted as threatening. In the darkness with adrenaline, movements can appear different than they look on camera. What seems clear in slow motion was confusing in real time. "Officer Scott, the camera shows Kyle Rogers with his hands on the car roof where you told him to put them. How is that threatening?" Sometimes compliance can be a tactic to position for an attack. Suspects can use apparent cooperation to get closer or to distract officers while reaching for weapons. Walsh's voice carried incredulity that echoed through the courtroom. "Officer Scott, are you testifying that Kyle Rogers was threatening you by following your instructions?" The absurdity of Scott's position became clear to everyone in the courtroom. He was arguing that perfect compliance justified lethal force, that following police instructions could be interpreted as threatening behavior. "Officer Scott," Walsh continued, "you fired 3 shots in rapid succession. Why did you continue firing after Kyle Rogers was falling?" The situation was dynamic. I couldn't tell if the threat had been neutralized until I was certain the suspect was no longer capable of harming anyone. "Officer Scott, how long does it take to determine that a person who has been shot in the chest and is falling to the ground is no longer a threat?" Scott had no good answer. His continued firing after Kyle was incapacitated demonstrated either panic that disqualified him from police work or deliberate execution that constituted murder. The prosecution's closing argument lasted 2 hours, methodically reviewing evidence that demonstrated Scott's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Walsh stood before the jury with photographs of Kyle Rogers and his constitutional law textbooks, reminding them that a young man's dreams had been destroyed by an officer who valued power over justice. "Ladies and gentlemen, Kyle Rogers died because Nathan Scott decided that a young black man driving through his neighborhood looked suspicious. Kyle followed every rule, showed perfect compliance, and was murdered anyway. This is not about officer safety. This is about an officer who thought he could kill with impunity because the system had always protected him before." Walsh reviewed the evidence methodically. The body camera footage showing Kyle's compliance, the autopsy proving excessive force, the pattern of previous brutality, the social media posts revealing racial bias, and Scott's own testimony that contradicted physical evidence. Nathan Scott murdered Kyle Rogers because he saw a young black man and decided that was threat enough to justify lethal force. Kyle Rogers died studying constitutional law that should have protected him from exactly this kind of police violence. The defense closing argument lasted 30 minutes. Davidson acknowledging that the evidence was damaging, but asking jurors to consider the pressures of police work and the split-second decisions officers must make. Officer Scott made a mistake under pressure, but that mistake doesn't constitute murder. Police officers must make life-and-death decisions in seconds, and we cannot judge those decisions with the benefit of hindsight and slow-motion video. Officer Scott believed he was protecting public safety, and that belief was reasonable given his training and experience. But Davidson's argument couldn't overcome the visual evidence of Kyle's compliance and Scott's continued firing after any threat had ended. The jury had seen Kyle Rogers die, and they had heard Scott's inadequate explanations for his actions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning unanimous guilty verdicts on all charges: federal civil rights violations resulting in death, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The convictions carried mandatory minimum sentences that would ensure Scott spent the rest of his life in federal prison. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but addressed Scott directly after the verdicts were read. "Mr. Scott, you have been convicted of murdering Kyle Rogers, a young man whose only crime was driving while black in a neighborhood where you decided he didn't belong. Your actions have brought shame on law enforcement and violated the constitutional rights you swore to protect." The courtroom erupted in applause from Kyle's family and supporters, quickly silenced by Judge Morrison's gavel. Federal marshals moved to handcuff Scott, who showed no emotion as he was led away to begin serving what would likely be a life sentence. Judge Harrison Rogers felt a measure of satisfaction as Scott was led away in handcuffs, but understood that criminal convictions were only part of the justice his son deserved. The federal consent decree that would transform police operations was equally important for preventing future tragedies. Lieutenant Thompson and Captain Walsh were tried separately and convicted of conspiracy to violate civil rights and deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. Their convictions sent a clear message that supervisors who protect bad officers would face federal prosecution. The trials generated national media coverage that turned Kyle Rogers into a symbol of the need for police reform. His photograph appeared on magazine covers, alongside headlines about constitutional policing and federal oversight of local law enforcement. Dr. Patricia Rogers attended Scott's sentencing hearing, where she addressed the court about her son's character and the impact of his death on their family. Kyle Rogers believed that the system could be reformed through dedication and hard work, she told Judge Morrison. He was studying constitutional law when Nathan Scott killed him, learning about the protections that should have saved his life. I don't want revenge. I want Kyle's death to mean something. I want other mothers to know that their sons can drive home from study group without fear of being murdered by police. Judge Morrison sentenced Nathan Scott to life in federal prison without possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under federal civil rights statutes. Mr. Scott, you have committed one of the most serious crimes possible, the murder of a citizen under color of law. Kyle Rogers' death represents a betrayal of everything law enforcement should represent. You will spend the rest of your life in federal prison, where you will have time to reflect on the constitutional rights you violated and the young man whose life you stole. The sentencing brought closure to the criminal proceedings, but Judge Harrison Rogers understood that Kyle's death had triggered changes that would extend far beyond individual punishments. The federal consent decree imposing oversight on police operations would be Kyle's lasting legacy. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Rogers remained seated, thinking about his son's dedication to constitutional law and criminal justice reform. Kyle had believed that the system could be improved through education and persistent effort. His death had proven that sometimes federal intervention was necessary to force compliance with constitutional principles. Justice had been delivered by federal prosecutors wearing the authority of the United States government, by FBI agents who investigated without fear of local politics, and by federal judges who understood that constitutional rights were not subject to local preferences. Nathan Scott would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, a symbol of what happened when officers decided that badges gave them permission to murder citizens. The system that had protected him had been dismantled by federal authority, and constitutional policing would be enforced by federal monitors. Kyle Rogers' name would be remembered not just as a victim, but as the catalyst for federal intervention that finally made equal justice under law a reality, rather than just a constitutional promise. 6 months after Nathan Scott was sentenced to life in federal prison, Judge Harrison Rogers stood before a gathering of law students at Georgetown University Law School, the same institution Kyle had dreamed of attending. The auditorium was packed with future lawyers who understood that Kyle Rogers' death had changed the landscape of police accountability forever. Kyle Rogers believed that the law could be a force for justice. Judge Rogers told the audience, his voice carrying the weight of a father's grief, transformed into purpose. He was studying constitutional law when he was murdered, learning about protections that should have saved his life. Today, I'm here to announce the Kyle Rogers Memorial Scholarship for students dedicated to civil rights and police accountability. The scholarship, funded by settlements from civil lawsuits against the police department and donations from legal organizations nationwide, would provide full tuition for law students committed to constitutional policing reform. Kyle's death was being transformed into educational opportunities for young lawyers who would carry forward his vision of justice. Dr. Patricia Rogers, speaking via video from Atlanta, where she had established a similar scholarship at Emory University School of Medicine, addressed the audience about her son's character and dreams. Kyle wanted to be a prosecutor who held bad cops accountable while supporting good officers who served their communities with integrity. This scholarship will help future lawyers accomplish what Kyle never had the chance to do. The federal consent decree that had been imposed on the police department was already producing dramatic changes in how officers interacted with the community. Federal monitors supervised training programs that emphasized de-escalation and constitutional policing, while civilian oversight boards reviewed every use of force incident with real authority to discipline officers. Chief Patterson had resigned in disgrace, replaced by Dr. Angela Martinez, a criminal justice professor with expertise in constitutional policing, who had been appointed by federal authorities to implement reforms. Chief Martinez's first action was to fire 12 officers with histories of excessive force complaints, sending a clear message that the culture of protection was over. The Kyle Rogers case taught us that we cannot reform police departments from within when those departments are committed to protecting bad officers. Chief Martinez told reporters during her first press conference, "Federal oversight has given us the authority to prioritize constitutional rights over officer protection, and that's exactly what we're going to do." Officer Maria Santos had been promoted to sergeant and assigned to train new recruits on constitutional policing and proper use of force protocols. Her decision to break the blue wall of silence had been vindicated by federal investigators who praised her courage in exposing systematic civil rights violations. Kyle Rogers died because officers like me stayed silent about misconduct we witnessed, Sergeant Santos told new recruits during their first week of training. Your job is to protect constitutional rights, not to protect bad officers who violate those rights. If you see misconduct and don't report it, you're complicit in the next Kyle Rogers. The training program implemented under federal oversight emphasized constitutional principles that Kyle had been studying when he was killed. Recruits learned about the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches, the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection, and the federal civil rights statutes that could send officers to prison for violating citizens' rights. Nathan Scott was serving his life sentence at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, where the most dangerous criminals were housed in solitary confinement. His cell contained law books where he studied the constitutional principles he had violated, understanding too late that Kyle Rogers had known more about police authority than the officer who killed him. Scott's appeals had been rejected by every federal court, with judges consistently ruling that his conviction was supported by overwhelming evidence of deliberate civil rights violations. His case had become a textbook example of how federal prosecutors could hold local police accountable when local authorities failed to protect constitutional rights. Former Lieutenant Thompson and Captain Walsh were serving 15-year federal sentences for conspiracy to violate civil rights and deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. Their convictions had ended their law enforcement careers and bankrupted them through legal fees and civil lawsuit settlements. The federal civil rights lawsuit filed by Kyle's family had resulted in a $15 million settlement that included admissions of systematic constitutional violations by the police department. The settlement funds were being used to establish community programs focused on police accountability and constitutional education. Judge Rogers had returned to his federal bench with renewed commitment to holding law enforcement accountable to constitutional standards. The police corruption trial he had been preparing when Kyle was killed had resulted in federal oversight that transformed policing throughout the district. Kyle's death gave me clarity about the role federal courts must play in protecting constitutional rights. Judge Rogers explained to colleagues who had watched his transformation from reform-minded judge to relentless advocate for federal intervention. When local authorities won't police themselves, federal authority must step in to ensure that constitutional rights are protected. The Kyle Rogers Constitutional Policing Act, introduced in Congress by representatives who had been moved by Kyle's story, proposed federal standards for police training, federal oversight of departments with histories of civil rights violations, and federal prosecution of officers who violated constitutional rights. Kyle Rogers was studying constitutional law when he was murdered by an officer who should have been protecting those same constitutional principles. Congresswoman Patricia Williams said during floor debate on the legislation, "This act will ensure that federal standards prevent future tragedies and hold officers accountable to the Constitution they swear to defend." The university where Kyle had been a student established the Rogers Center for Constitutional Policing, a research institute dedicated to developing best practices for law enforcement accountability. The center's first report documented how federal oversight had reduced excessive force incidents by 70% in departments operating under consent decrees. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, Kyle's former constitutional law professor, served as the center's director and continued to teach the course Kyle had been taking when he died. Kyle Rogers understood that constitutional protections are only meaningful when they're enforced, she told her students. His death demonstrated the consequences of allowing law enforcement to operate without adequate oversight. Kyle's former study group partners had graduated and were working as civil rights lawyers, prosecutors, specializing in police misconduct cases, and federal clerks, helping judges craft decisions that protected constitutional rights. Kyle's influence extended through every lawyer he had studied with, every case they handled, every constitutional principle they defended. Marcus Johnson, the college student Scott had beaten before killing Kyle, had graduated from law school, and was working as a federal prosecutor, specializing in civil rights violations. His first case involved an officer with a pattern of excessive force complaints who had been protected by supervisors, exactly the situation that had enabled Kyle's death. Kyle Rogers never got the chance to become the prosecutor he wanted to be, Johnson told juries during his opening statements, but his death taught us that constitutional rights must be enforced by federal authority when local authorities fail to protect citizens. The community where Kyle had lived and died had been transformed by federal oversight and the activism his death had inspired. Civilian review boards, with real authority, investigated police misconduct. Body cameras were mandatory and could not be turned off, and federal monitors ensured that constitutional training was effective rather than superficial. Reverend Michael Williams, who had led peaceful protests demanding justice for Kyle, now served on the Civilian Oversight Board that reviewed police conduct. Kyle Rogers' death was a tragedy, but it catalyzed changes that will protect other young people from officers who think badges give them permission to violate constitutional rights. The memorial garden established at the site where Kyle had been killed featured a bronze plaque with the text of the 4th and 14th Amendments, the constitutional protections Kyle had been studying when he died. Visitors included law students, civil rights activists, and police officers learning about the principles they had sworn to protect. On the second anniversary of Kyle's death, Judge Rogers visited the memorial garden with Kyle's mother, placing flowers beside the constitutional text their son had been studying when his life was stolen. The garden had become a pilgrimage site for people committed to constitutional policing and police accountability. Kyle believed that the system could be reformed through education and persistent effort, Dr. Rogers said, reading the inscription below Kyle's photograph. His death proved that sometimes federal intervention is necessary to force compliance with constitutional principles, but the education and effort he believed in are still essential. Judge Rogers had announced his intention to retire from the federal bench to teach constitutional law and police accountability, carrying forward Kyle's commitment to education as a tool for reform. His final case as a federal judge would be approving the consent decree modifications that made federal oversight of police operations permanent rather than temporary. Kyle Rogers' death changed my understanding of what federal judges must do to protect constitutional rights, he explained to reporters after announcing his retirement. Federal courts have the authority and responsibility to ensure that local police departments operate within constitutional boundaries, and I intend to teach future lawyers how to use that authority effectively. The Kyle Rogers Foundation, established with settlement funds and donations from legal organizations, provided scholarships for students from communities affected by police misconduct, funded research on constitutional policing, and supported legal clinics that represented victims of civil rights violations. Nathan Scott's former colleagues, who had witnessed his misconduct but stayed silent, were working in private security or had left law enforcement entirely, their careers destroyed by their complicity in constitutional violations. The blue wall of silence had been shattered by federal prosecutions that made clear the consequences of protecting bad officers. Officer Maria Santos, now Sergeant Santos, received commendations from federal authorities for her courage in exposing the systematic civil rights violations that had enabled Kyle's death. Her testimony had been crucial in securing convictions and implementing reforms that protected constitutional rights. Kyle Rogers died because good officers stayed silent about bad officers, Santos said during a conference on police accountability. Federal oversight has created an environment where good officers are protected when they report misconduct, and bad officers face real consequences for violating constitutional rights. The federal monitoring of police operations had become a model for other jurisdictions facing similar problems with excessive force and civil rights violations. Kyle Rogers' death had catalyzed a national conversation about federal oversight and constitutional policing that extended far beyond the city where he had died. As evening approached on the second anniversary of Kyle's death, Judge Rogers sat in his chambers for the final time as an active federal judge, reviewing the consent decree modifications that would make constitutional policing permanent in the city where his son had died. The reforms implemented in Kyle's memory had prevented dozens of similar tragedies and transformed police culture from protection to accountability. Kyle Rogers had been 20 years old when Nathan Scott murdered him. A pre-law student with dreams of using the legal system to promote justice and accountability. His death had accomplished more police reform than most lawyers achieved in entire careers, proving that sometimes tragedy could be transformed into lasting change. The federal oversight imposed after Kyle's death had created constitutional policing that protected citizens' rights, while supporting officers who served their communities with integrity. Kyle's belief that the system could be reformed had been vindicated, though the reform required federal intervention that Kyle had not anticipated. Judge Rogers closed Kyle's case file for the final time, understanding that his son's legacy would extend through every law student who received the Kyle Rogers Scholarship, every police officer trained in constitutional policing principles, every federal prosecutor who used civil rights statutes to hold bad cops accountable. Kyle Rogers had wanted to be a prosecutor who made the system better. His death had created prosecutors, judges, police chiefs, and activists who were making the system better in his memory. The constitutional law he had been studying when he died was now being enforced by federal authority that ensured equal protection under law was reality rather than just constitutional promise. Nathan Scott had thought he was killing just another young black man whose life didn't matter to anyone with power. Instead, he had killed the son of a federal judge who used every resource of the federal justice system to ensure that Kyle Rogers' death meant something, changed something, protected someone else's son from officers who thought badges gave them permission to murder. The legacy of Kyle Rogers would live on in every constitutional principle enforced, every civil rights violation prosecuted, every police department reformed under federal oversight. His death had been transformed into life, new life for constitutional policing, new life for federal accountability, new life for the belief that equal justice under law was possible when good people demanded it and federal authority enforced it. Have you ever believed that one person's sacrifice could change an entire system? Have you witnessed how federal authority can transform local institutions when constitutional rights are at stake? Kyle Rogers' story shows us that sometimes the most devastating tragedies can become catalysts for the most meaningful reforms, but only when people with power choose justice over protection. If this story moved you to believe that accountability and constitutional policing are possible, please like, share, and subscribe to Color of Justice. Help us continue telling stories that document both the persistence of systemic injustice and the power of federal intervention to protect constitutional rights. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that stories like Kyle's reach people who need to understand that change is possible when good people demand it and federal authority enforces it. Thank you for following Kyle Rogers' story from tragedy to transformation. Remember his name, honor his dreams, and continue the work he started, making constitutional law a living protection for all citizens, not just a promise on paper.